So today we're going to look at some of the stuff behind reactivity. So when we looked at the travelling Wilburys, the difficulty all of us have that no one tells us is a difficulty we have to deal with is that we're all damaged, we're all being wounded by past wounds that we don't see, so they're invisible. And when we get with somebody else, their wounds are invisible. But what happens, as you know from what we've talked about before, is that if in fact we put under enough pressure, then that reactivity, that past wounding comes up. And one of the things that creates it in part is the fact that we don't know our own needs and we're not good at asking or expressing our own needs. So we're going to deal a little bit more with that today. What happens later in life when you're hypnotised and overexposed and commercialised, or they could have also put in there, or if you get into a relationship, what happens is it means you have to be handled with care even more. So all of us have to be handled with care. Up till now, hopefully you've got to recognise that because of your attachment styles, if your perception of your partner is different than your partner's perception of what they're saying or doing, you're likely to react because you're getting a message from them which isn't the message they intend to give you. Now this is happening all the time, we do it all the time. So it's really difficult that with my inaccurate perception and emotional reaction versus your inaccurate perception and emotional reaction, we're going to lead to problems. One of the things that people do not do is they do not actually express their needs and preferences. So what happens is they often assume somebody else understands the needs and preference. Let me give you an example. If I say to my partner, oh, are you doing the dishes today? And they read that as, are you doing the dishes because, are you going to do the dishes because you're usually lazy and I don't have to do them, I don't have to do the dishes. In other words, if they make all those interpretations, what happens is you tend to get a trigger. And a lot of people's reactivities comes from just simple comments like that. And particularly if they're under-resourced, like they've had a bad day or something. So what has to happen is we have to learn to be expressive of exactly what our needs are. So you can say, hey look, I'm a bit tired. Do you have energy to do the dishes? Or are you okay doing those dishes? I'm tired, but I'm willing to help you if that's needed. In other words, we don't say enough. And it's partly because we don't grow up actually being very good at expressing what we prefer. And this leads to all sorts of difficulties. We have to learn to take responsibility for our inner process, whether we started the conflict or just made a minor contribution, and it's usually around this needs imbalance, because we react when those needs are out of balance. Okay, here are some upfront rules about conflict. Now, these sound really ridiculous because they seem so obvious, but in actual fact these rules really are really important to keep to. As soon as you can see there's a viewpoint clash, don't challenge what you can't fix. So for example, if in fact you ask if you're going to do the dishes and the other person reacts, the first thing is don't react to their reaction. So as soon as there's a viewpoint clash, recognize that the other person has misread or misinterpreted what you've said or asked. Secondly, don't challenge your debate when the other cannot share or agree to your viewpoint. So for example, if a partner says, oh, so you're really annoyed that I'm not doing the dishes, and that's not where they come from, it means you're on different pages right from the word go, and then you cannot talk about the situation because you perceived it entirely differently to each other. And this happens all the time. People doing this all the time. And the closer the relationship is to you, the more it's not likely to happen. Number 3, don't allow yourself to indulge in being a victim or a persecutor. You've really got to say to yourself, right, with my partner, if in fact I feel that they're slighting me or they're treating me like, I'm the dishes king and it's up to me to do all dishes or something, if you do that, you immediately become either a victim or a persecutor. First part of the book. Now that's not a good place to be, because it immediately means either you're disempowered or trying to get power back, and it's not going to work. So number 4, stop in your tracks and try to care for your partner and yourself. You simply learn not to go down the track of conflict. Something's gone wrong, so what's the need when something's gone wrong? It's to actually get clarification, rather than keep arguing. 5, grip your seat for a rough ride on a fast train, which might not be stopping anytime soon if you get into that spin. Number 6, take care of your own needs whilst doing your best to support your partner, if you've not been too heavily triggered yourself. So you might say, I can see you reacting a bit about those dishes. I was just wanting to know if you're going to do them. I wasn't expecting you to do them or anything. Can we just discuss this? In other words, you slow down, because as long as there are 2 children in the room, we've got a problem. If there's only 1 child and there's 1 adult who's actually trying to calm the situation and talk it out, then you're in a better place. Now this page is very, very important, because handling us with care is not something people know to do, because they don't know where the problem arises. They don't realise, as if there's a miscue, there's actually a need for patience, slowing down and actually just seeing where each other's at. Does that make sense to you? Okay. So, I'm going to talk about extremes. Even though we might not normally be the extremes, you'll recognise yourself on these 2 pages, this one and the next one. First of all, let's talk about extremes of avoidant or dismissive tendencies, predominantly men. The fears of under-empowerment, being controlled, being shamed, criticised, so bossy, dominant, and so what happens is that if you're feeling controlled, shamed, criticised, you can become bossy, dominant, and self-centred. And the extremes, that actually tends towards narcissism. Narcissism really is narcissists are really a very small percentage of the population, full narcissists, about 1%. But in certain environments, they're a much higher percentage. And for example, in CEOs, it's considered they're about 50% narcissists, because they're really empowered. They just want to do it their own way. They want to make money and so on. So what happens if you have that narcissistic trend, and all avoidants have to be careful about this, because they can, in extreme circumstances, swing that way. They have a tendency to be demanding, manipulative, or false caring. Now that really isn't true of most avoidants, but that's where people get to in extremes. The narcissistic tendency is also to be extremely self-serving and in truth cares little about the plight of anyone else. Now, we all get to the place where we don't really care about anyone else occasionally, like we can really be pushed to an edge. But the truth is, that's not a good place to be, because that means we believe that everyone else around us, or who we're interacting with, is the enemy. And that's very rarely the case. Thirdly, it has an ability to argue confusingly in order to avoid accountability, the anxiety of coping with anything other than what they want. So what narcissists can do, and avoidants can do in extreme cases where they've really lost the plot, is they can intentionally argue confusingly. This is called gaslighting. I don't know if you've heard of the term gaslighting. It comes from a movie, I think in the 1940s or something, where the guy was turning off and on the gaslight, and when his partner talked about it, he said, "What's the problem? I'm not touching the gaslight," like you must be imagining it. So that sort of talking people into a place where they're confused. Now, the anxious style has a much higher tendency to get into confusion about that. Avoidants don't tend to be easily confused by what others say, because they back themselves too much. Number 4, there is a tendency in extreme avoidant and dismissive behaviours to get more exploitative, entitled, they have empathic impairment, and they have grandiosity. Now I'm telling you these extremes not because you're likely to have them, but because if you do any of that, you've allowed your own pattern to go to an extreme if you're the avoidant type. So let's look at the anxious equivalent. So what's likely to trigger the anxious, or predominantly the female style, is fears of under-empowerment, being hard, with the fact that they seem to be hard work, needy, angry. They're often told they're crazy because they're so consumed by fears of being overlooked or overpowered. So this, in its extreme form, tends towards borderline. Now, it doesn't really matter what borderline, these words are just words, but what happens in the anxious and secure person when these extremes hit, they become highly emotional, highly emotionally charged, because they fear they're not being heard, not being listened to, and so on. So you can see it's not unusual for women to say get worked up, or if they're not heard, not understood, and so on, but this is an extreme variant of this. So there's a tendency then to be anxious when insufficient caring or empathy or understanding from another. Now remember, that anxiousness can come from a perception, not a reality. If in fact they feel like they're not being heard, or the other person is disengaged because they're avoidant and they're preoccupied or something, then they can get really, really anxious. In fact, I don't matter, I'm not being cared for, and so on. They have fears of losing their own preferences, so they become emotionally demanding or abusive in order to gain control. So that the anxious style, because of the disempowerment, can really ramp up if in fact they feel they have to do that to get attention. Of course, it has the exact opposite effect, because the avoidance will just back away or close down to that. There's a tendency to be threatening in order to hold on to power and control. That's at its worst extreme. And borderlines do that. They are very, very, they can be, I've had borderlines who have threatened to burn the house down, do all sorts of extreme things when they've not got things, where they haven't been listened to and so on. But those are extreme examples. Okay. So I thought I'd just give you those extremes, just to warn you not to allow yourself to go there. Now, so let's get to needs, values, and power in a relationship. Extreme behaviours fueled by emotional intensity can be seen to some extent in all of us. We each sit somewhere on the spectrum. So the top spectrum is strongly avoidant, is really way down one end, which is mostly masculine, up to strongly anxious, very insecure at the other end, which is predominantly female. I use these gender things because it's a general rule, but there are important exceptions to it. So if we look at the extremes, the avoidant is likely to become extremely anxious and self-serving, whereas the anxious person is going to feel very disconnected. So they're anxious for different reasons. So an example of the anxious self-serving is where guys get really anxious about tasks, about work, about getting things done, about the financial situation. That tends to be a more avoidant tendency. Up at the other end, the female, the anxious and secure style, tends to be more worried about connection. So they're going to get more worked up if there's disconnection, as a general rule. Now, also, the avoidant style tends to be when they're in extremes, they tend to be closed to cooperation. They just have to get the job done. They just want to focus on getting stuff done. So they disconnect even more because of their anxiety. And at the other end, the anxious and secure are reliant on cooperation. So you can see, if they go into extremes, how one extreme triggers the other. Does that make sense to you? Again, at extremes, the avoidant will tend to be overly empowered. They back themselves, they back their own viewpoint, they back the importance of the task, they back just getting it done. At the other end, the anxious and secure feel more disempowered the more their partner feels overly empowered. So there's a real power difference. Now, what is very interesting, when I trained in emotionally focused therapy, I started training in 2007. Emotionally focused therapy really grew out of an understanding of attachment theory, even though they didn't use attachment theory as much as I do. What happened was the originator of EFT, Susan Johnson, originally worked with a guy called Les Greenberg, and they then split. And I don't know all the details of why they split. But Les Greenberg felt that the focus was really on power differential, but Sue Johnson recognized that in fact it was more about actually attachment and whether people wanted to connect or not connect. So when I first trained in EFT, avoidants were called withdrawers, and the anxious types were called pursuers. They're still called that in EFT. But in my view, that's a very, very simplistic coverage of, there's so many variations on that. But fundamentally, avoidants do close down under stress, and the anxious style actually want to connect, and they get ramped up if the connection isn't happening. But what is really interesting is, I've noticed that in fact, empowerment is built into attachment styles. So the overly empowered, predominantly male avoidant style, when I say it's overly empowered, most avoidants are just appropriately empowered. They just back themselves, they back their viewpoint and so on. But the trouble is, very often they're dealing with a partner who tends to get disempowered. So when they say, well, I just think we should be doing this, I think, we should just do the dishes now and then they go out the door. And the partner is likely to meet their need because they've stated it so firmly. And so for the female, predominantly anxious, insecure person, their challenge is to be empowered. So what I felt Les Greenberg did is he actually realized that empowerment was behind a lot of this. And just recently I heard that Sue Johnson had said she's recognized that disempowerment is a predominantly female problem. I don't think it's a gender problem. I think it's an attachment style problem. I mean, she might be right, I don't know. It's really interesting. To me, it's an attachment style difference. Now, this is important because it means that if you're a guy, you can be overly empowered relative to your partner, but you don't know it because you're not trying to be dominant. You're not trying to override them, but they can hear it that way. So that means you've really got to try and engage and make sure that they're not being disempowered. Also, the avoidants we know are very pragmatically focused on task, getting things sorted, because that's what gives them anxiety. Whereas the anxious person is very empathic because they can tune in to where people are at, if they're upset and so on, and they want to talk about it. I thought I'd give you this slide because it sort of gives extremes of what you're dealing with. Does it sort of make sense to you? Does it help you to understand that? But remember, we don't consider that there's a better or worse style. The anxious style is usually better at connecting. But the avoidant style, if you like, is really wired to actually make ends meet and stuff like that. It's a general skew, but of course there are lots of overlap. So the anxious style often can be good workers and so on too. But when you get into close relationship, so it's different. For example, the empowerment thing is quite different in the workforce. So a woman, for example, can be very empowered in the workforce, but not empowered back home. You see, it's specific to the couple thing, to the close interaction. So what I'd like you to do is to take a moment to discuss these attachment differences, what you now understand about each other and how your cycle functions. I just want to get your feedback as to whether or not you feel like you're understanding the pattern and you're understanding examples of it, and do you have strategies for not getting caught in the differences. So take turns of approximately equal length. So I want you to go back into what we talked about last time, trying to not speak for too long, talk for and about yourself, so talking about me, what goes on for me, rather than your partner, not for about what your partner does or doesn't do. Now in the book, I want you to start making sure that page 242 and 43, where the old pattern that you got caught in, I want you to start to really build up a profile, because I want you to get to know this. You won't remember this in, say, a few months' time. I want you to write it down so you really go back to any time and remember what you've learned about the way you're wired, the way your partner's wired. Now, if in fact you are an anxious avoidant type, you're going to have a foot in both worlds. So it's going to be a little bit more complex. And you've got to think, okay, so when do I become avoidant, or when do I become anxious, and how does that work? Most anxious avoidant people are females, and generally speaking, even if they present as more avoidant, they're usually really wanting to be connectors. So the connection is really deep down somewhere, even though they might be behaving avoidantly. And it's very important, if you are one of those, to record that, because you can flip a little bit. And sometimes if you become avoidant, you're really not doing any favour to the part of you that wants to be connecting. It makes sense. Okay? Thank you, Nick. Let's go off and have a wee chat about that. I'll leave the slide on so you can do that. Take your books with you. Grab a pen if you need one up here.